I was there, hated the day. The day was a miserable day. I mean, it was the worst royal engagement I ever did, a royal wedding I ever did. And I travelled the world with him, and I did really enjoy working with him. But, you know, now I really don't care if I ever see him again, because the way he's behaved towards the king and our queen and his brother and his sister.
Forget the fairy tale you saw on TV. Meghan Markle and Prince Harry's royal wedding wasn't a celebration. It was a circus carefully staged for cameras and celebrity headlines. The glossy carriages, the music, the glamorous guest shots, pure performance.
She delivered it like an actress delivered it, an opera responded going, wow.
Behind the scenes, according to royal photographer Arthur Edwards, it was chaos, discomfort, and blatant disrespect for royal tradition. Guests sweated under brutal sun, crammed into stuffy coats and gowns while trying not to faint. Senior royals, people who dedicated decades of service, were shoved to the back rows. Meanwhile, Hollywood nobodies and Meghan's industry pals paraded in prime seats like it was their personal runway.
All my life, you know, and then Oprah Winfrey had met them once. She was a guest. The Clooneys, the guests. I mean, never met them before, but they were the guests. And, you know, I thought to myself, this all showbiz rubbish.
Even the press, the very machine that fueled the spectacle, was punished. Harry refused to look at cameras, deliberately ducking moments, sending photographers scrambling as though sneaking shots of a paparazzi shy beaster. Arthur admitted he couldn't get a single usable photo. The only royal wedding where that ever happened.
So he was angry, and I felt we were punished for that. In fact, I never got one picture in the paper published from that day.
And Meghan, she treated it less like a joining of families and more like the debut of her personal brand. Forget love, forget unity. This was a launch party, not a wedding. What looked like a fairy tale to the world was in reality a carefully constructed illusion, and an ugly one at that. On television, the wedding was polished to perfection. Flags waving, choirs belting, celebrities glowing. Millions believed they were witnessing a modern royal love story play out in real time. But those who had a front row seat didn't see magic. They saw misery. The atmosphere was suffocating, not romantic. Guests packed inside Windsor under blinding heat, forced to sit for hours as sweat poured down their designer suits and dresses. Women clutched fans like lifelines, makeup running, tempers flaring. This wasn't elegance. It was survival. Edwards himself described the ordeal as the worst royal engagement he had ever worked.
Oh, I was there, hated the day. The day was a miserable day. I mean, it was the worst royal engagement I ever did, a royal wedding I ever.
He'd survived decades of events from Charles and Diana to William and Kate. Yet, he said nothing compared to this disaster. The problem wasn't the weather. Royal weddings have weathered rain, wind, or heat before. What made this different was the sheer lack of care. It felt like the comfort of attendees didn't matter. Only the optics for cameras broadcasting around the globe. Smiles plastered on the screens hid exhaustion and frustration off camera. The so-called day of joy was in reality a boiling, uncomfortable endurance test.
Harry was determined to keep the newspapers away from it as much as possible. Everything was done on long lenses. I mean, Akaito had an 800mm lens photographing the guests arrival.
A fairy tale for viewers. Yes, but for those trapped inside, it was nothing short of unbearable. If the heat wasn't enough, the seating plan turned humiliation into a headline. Decades of royal service suddenly counted for nothing. Distinguished family members, military veterans, and senior royals, people who had carried the monarchy's weight for years, were pushed to the sidelines, dumped in the back rows like afterthoughts. Meanwhile, Hollywood celebrities, many of whom barely knew Meghan or Harry, strutted into prime seats at the front. It wasn't about family honoring its own. It was about which face would look best when the camera zoomed in.
The photographers they engaged for the job was 5 feet away, you know, it was just hopeless. And then the carriage shot, when they went past me in the carriage, they looked the other way. So for me, it was a disaster.
Arthur Edwards himself, a man who has captured world-changing royal moments, joked he needed a GPS to figure out where he was sitting. His view blocked, his work sabotaged. Imagine serving the crown faithfully for decades only to be treated like background scenery, while complete strangers soaked in the spotlight. Guests whispered their disbelief, some calling it nothing more than a red carpet networking stunt. It no longer felt like Windsor Castle. It felt like a glossy Hollywood Awards show stage in royal clothing. The message was clear. Tradition and loyalty didn't matter. Status and star power did. This wasn't respect for the monarchy. It was blatant disregard for it. If guests hoped the reception would redeem the misery, they were in for another slap in the face.
When I think, done some really lovely royal weddings. I did both King Charles's weddings. I did William's wedding. I did Andrew's wedding. I did Sophie and Edward. You know, I mean, they were lovely occasions. But that today, I couldn't get out of Windsor quick enough. I promise you that.
The worst royal wedding to cover.
Yeah.
A royal wedding is supposed to mean grandeur, tables groaning with food, champagne flowing, and banquets that make headlines. Instead, Meghan and Harry dished out what can only be described as a glorified cocktail hour. Finger foods and tiny canopies replaced the rich spreads of previous royal occasions. Guests dressed in 1,000-pound outfits were left nibbling on microscopic bites of avocado toast and macarons, barely enough to satisfy a child. People whispered their disbelief, shocked that the so-called wedding of the decade couldn't even feed its audience. Some left it off. Others were quietly furious. Edwards himself described the portions as pathetic, nothing fitting for a monarchy built on tradition, scale, and spectacle. The food felt symbolic, meager, all presentation, and no substance. And this wasn't an oversight. This was deliberate minimalism, a performance designed to look chic and modern for glossy magazine photos. In reality, it left people hungry and unimpressed. Instead of royal abundance, guests walked away craving a proper meal. For many, it confirmed the suspicion. This wasn't a royal wedding. It was a public relations show dressed up with crumbs, as if the suffocating heat, humiliating seating, and pitiful snacks weren't enough. Prince Harry decided to turn the wedding into a personal vendetta.
I felt so. I felt that wasn't just me, it was the whole of the British press. You know, they were in many ways badly treated. I think it was, Harry was angry with us really because some of the things that had been said about Meghan, and quite rightly, some of the things that were said about Meghan during the engagement were pretty hard.
Instead of embracing the press, a royal duty every monarch before him understood, Harry glared at cameras, dodged angles, and physically positioned himself to avoid photographs. For Arthur Edwards and other professionals on duty, it was a nightmare. They weren't dealing with a future king. They were dealing with a sulking celebrity, throwing a tantrum. Every opportunity where tradition called for a posed smile or elegant shot, Harry looked away or blocked the view, almost daring photographers to capture anything usable. Edwards, who photographed Charles, Diana, William, and Kate with ease, admitted this was the first royal wedding where not one respectable photo emerged.
I mean, obviously, when William was born and Harry was born and George and Charlotte and Louis, we got great pictures outside the hospital. I remember, and William and Catherine especially, they made such an effort to show the whole world their new...
That wasn't an accident. It was Harry's chosen punishment for the British media, whom he blamed for Meghan's rough reception in the press. Instead of rising above, he weaponized the wedding against them. The result, a day meant to showcase joy and unity, was stained by petty hostility. This wasn't a man of duty. It was a man seething with bitterness, prioritizing grudges over history. If the royals trusted him to uphold tradition, Harry made it clear he wanted war. Royal weddings are meant to blend pageantry with centuries of ritual, symbols that bind the monarchy together. Instead, Meghan and Harry ripped those traditions apart and replaced them with spectacle tailored for headlines.
I have to say, though, you know, that first year of Meghan, working with her on the road, you know, we went all over the country. She was incredible. I mean, I thought she was a great asset to the family.
From the sermon delivered as though it were a Hollywood monologue to the Americanized performances injected into the ceremony, everything screamed, "Look at us," rather than "Honor the crown." It wasn't the sacred continuity of past royal unions. It was a rebrand. Edwards noticed it immediately. Nothing about the day reflected the steadiness of monarchy. It echoed a staged event curated for the global press. Rituals that marked loyalty and unity were stripped down, dismissed as outdated, and swapped for flashy stunts designed to provoke discussion on social media. For many guests, the symbolism was painful. This wasn't Charles and Diana cementing royal destiny, nor William and Kate uniting tradition with modern grace. It was Meghan and Harry drawing a line in the sand, saying, We're different. We don't need the family, and we don't want their rules.
I knew they'd be seething. I knew the Queen would be seething. I knew that the Prince of Wales, Prince Charles would be seething. It would be so unfair.
What should have been a royal celebration became a declaration of independence, one that mocked the very institution paying for it. In breaking from tradition, they weren't innovating. They were burning bridges. Once the confetti settled, the so-called fairy tale collapsed into cold silence. Meghan and Harry didn't just distance themselves from the royal fold. They slammed the door shut and welded it closed. Invitations to stay at royal estates were brushed off with Harry insisting on hotels and private security to keep control. Family gatherings dwindled. Grandparents who longed for time with Archie and Leet found themselves cut off, watching their grandchildren grow up as strangers.
Of Archie that was taken by the Press Association and showing her on my phone, and that was the first time she saw him, so it was difficult.
And Edward's called it heartbreaking. An entire generation of young royals missing out on cousins, traditions, and bonds that defined a family legacy. What made it sting more was the hypocrisy. The couple preached endlessly about the importance of family and compassion, yet denied their children relationships with their own blood. To them, privacy wasn't protection. It was a shield to push the royals out while selling their story to the world.
And then when the baby was born, when Archie was born, that was another, in my view, a disaster, because I knew we was not going to get a picture of it. Everybody was hoping we would get.
The wedding hadn't united families. It fractured them further. Every cold shoulder, every refusal to engage, every snub chipped away at any chance of reconciliation. What began as a glamorous spectacle ended as a campaign of estrangement. For the royals, it was betrayal disguised as independence. For the children, it was simply loss. If the wedding was a performance, the Oprah interview was the encore, and it was twice as ruthless. Meghan and Harry sat in front of cameras, not to heal, but to detonate. They lobbed accusations of racism and cruelty at the royal family, painting themselves as martyrs in a one-sided narrative where no one else got to speak. Edwards called it exactly what it was: a stunt, not a conversation, not a truth-telling mission, a staged attack designed to keep the spotlight firmly fixed on.
And it's one of the saddest things of all, Matt, of course, is that the children don't get to see their grandfather. That's really so awful, because they're not getting to meet their cousins and to know their cousins. Such a shame for them.
Timing said it all. When sympathy was fading, when their star power risked dimming, they manufactured a scandal big enough to dominate headlines for weeks. The interview wasn't about reconciliation. It was about profit, publicity, and brand building. Millions tuned in thinking they'd hear honesty. What they really watched was a rehearsed script crafted to embarrass the monarchy and elevate Team Sussex as victims. And the backlash: families torn deeper apart, trust buried beyond repair, and centuries of royal dignity dragged into Oprah's backyard. For Meghan and Harry, it didn't matter. The chaos guaranteed coverage, and coverage meant relevance. It was less confession, more extraction. A royal meltdown packaged as primetime drama. And that's the real legacy of Meghan and Harry's wedding. Not a celebration, not a moment of unity, but the opening act of a long-running circus. What the world saw as a glittering fairy tale was behind the cameras, a boiling scandal built on arrogance. Guests baked in the heat. Loyal royals were shoved aside for B-list celebrities. Food was laughable and photographers were punished for simply doing their jobs. Instead of honoring centuries of tradition, the couple used the platform as a stepping stone to launch their own global brand. And once the wedding ended, they cashed it in with staged interviews, media tantrums, and family estrangement. Every move screamed power play. Every choice chipped away at dignity. They didn't join the monarchy. They hijacked it, then set it on fire in front of millions. But here's the kicker. This wedding disaster wasn't just a beginning. It was a roadmap. The chaos, the drama, the showbiz. It never stopped. Meghan and Harry turned scandal into currency, and the world watched in disbelief. If you thought this breakdown was brutal, wait until you see how Trevor Noah hilariously destroys Meghan Markle on live TV. That video is up right now